eligibility in the chat. We also provided the link for community funding projects and appropriation request forms. If you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to email ny14appropriations@mail.house.gov. We'll now move on to the Q&A section of our town hall. As mentioned earlier, constituents sign on via the Zoom platform and use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Please mention what neighborhood, city you are from. Remember, you may write your questions in Spanish. Also, a reminder to the members of the press that after the Q&A, there will be a press gaggle where you will be able to pose your questions. All right, let's go to our first question. Congresswoman, this comes from William from Jackson Heights. As a DACA recipient, I'm concerned that Congress and the president is allowing anti-immigrant groups and Republicans to hijack the border narrative and paint a negative picture of immigrants to the detriment of real reform. What kind of work is being done to reach across the aisle to pass reform? Secondly, what kind of initiatives are being taken to ensure that an accurate picture of immigration is being portrayed in the media and to the public?
Yeah. Well, this is an excellent question. And I want to dive in, head first in really discussing what is behind what's going on at the border. As we've seen, there are arrivals of undocumented children, rather unaccompanied children that have come at the border. And this has led to completely inhumane and unacceptable, horrifying conditions of children in CBP custody. And it's unacceptable and it's horrifying. And I've been to these facilities. I've seen these facilities. As we know, we've been a part of this issue and engaged in this issue, and actually trying to figure out real solutions on this for a long time. So I'm going to start with yesterday I spoke a little bit on this on social media, but I'm going to get a little bit into this. I started with the macro yesterday. I want to start with the micro today, where people, I think we're looking at what's going on in these facilities. It's unacceptable, it's horrifying, and it's a result of the fact that we have built our immigration system on the same principles and scaffolding as our carceral system. And neither are just, and neither are currently designed to, or exist to suit the needs that help us as a people. And so, one of the things that we know and that I've believed for a very long time is that these systems for processing, which is the word that's used, which is also carceral language, but these systems that exist are wrong. They're wrong. These are facilities that are designed the way that our carceral facilities are designed. And they're designed, and our carceral facilities are not even designed in a way that suit our human or even societal needs to actually solve the problems that we have. So what's actually behind what we're seeing in these conditions? One is that when we have these kind of undulations, right? When we have these larger numbers that come up of unaccompanied children at our border, what we see is a couple of things. We have the reason why they're coming, which is sending the reason why these larger numbers are coming, and then the reason why they are prevented from kind of moving on, or what's keeping them from moving on. It's blocking them, which creates this huge pile up of inhumane conditions that are wrong. And so let's talk about this part here where children, which are preventing the actual processing of children as quickly as possible, because under normal conditions, what happens is that if an unaccompanied child arrives to our border, they are not supposed to be held in CBP, which is Customs and Border Patrol. They're not supposed to be detained by CBP. They're not supposed to be kept or transferred or et cetera, detained by ICE. They're supposed to be held, and their care is supposed to be managed by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, I believe. And under that, Health and Human Services. Those are different facilities that I have also toured, which are, in a lot of ways, have a lot of proximity to social service facilities. They have teachers, they have social workers, and essentially what happens is that about 80% of the kids that we see come in have a direct and named family member in the United States. 80%. So 80% of the kids that we see have a family member here that is named, and the vast majority of times can be located. And so what is happening is that for a lot of kids, that time, our current processes and the current way that the administration, or that many administrations try to find these kids' families, is that they have to locate them. And then there is an elevated responsibility or an elevated duty to verify their identity. So that includes DNA tests, that can include other forms of documentation, et cetera. And what had happened recently with the Trump administration is that a lot of times people would come forward to claim the child in their family, and they were arrested by the Trump administration. So there's a lot of fear. In some cases, this is not in general what's going on, but this is a contributing factor. There's a lot of fear among a lot of communities about coming forward to reunite with a child. That's in some cases. In other cases, it just takes, it's that elevated duty to verify identity, et cetera, can take upwards of a month. And when you have more children that are arriving unaccompanied, it creates what we're seeing in these facilities, which then HHS is not able to hold them. And then we have these complete inhumane conditions at CBP facilities and some of just the horrifying things that we've seen. Now, the first thing I want to say is that the fact that this keeps happening over and over and over again is a political failure by both parties. And I want to be very clear about that, because I don't want to draw false equivalence. What is happening here is not the same as what happened during the Trump administration, where they took babies out of the arms of their mothers and deported their families and permanently traumatized these children, some of whom we don't know will ever be reunified with their family again, which is a level of human rights violation that is just simply not the same. Both of these things are barbaric and they're wrong. But when you rip a baby out of the hands of a mother, you cannot draw the same comparison. And anyone who is trying to do that is doing a profound disservice to the cause of justice. So I don't want to excuse any of this, but I don't think we should also get them twisted together, because one is not the same. And we cannot dust that under the rug. And by the way, those families are owed reparations, period. Now I'll move on and continue on this issue. So we have this surge that's going, or rather we have this surge which people are saying, and we have to address that term because it is wrong. And people are pushing back, when we talk about this. And when they say that, the reason why we shouldn't use that term is because this is not an invasion. And in fact, when you want to talk about that, we should be owning the fact that US foreign policy has contributed to the destabilization of these regions and of the very countries that are now mired in a lot of violence that these families and these children are fleeing. So we cannot use that term, not to police it, not to be politically correct, but because we know what the level and the steps of dehumanization lead to. We just experienced this last year. And I'm not going to allow the Stephen Millers of the world to pretend that he didn't do what he did and to act like this is the same. I have been in contact with the Biden administration personally. And what I can tell you that's different about this administration, again, I'm not here to excuse it. I'm not here to say this is good. I'm not here to do anything. But one thing that is different is that they're trying to figure out and they're trying to create the resources to actually end this problem. And the Trump administration was contributing to it. They contributed to it with zero tolerance. They contributed it with the fear. They contributed it with this freaking census question. They contributed to it. So all of this is to say that there's no excuse for this system, that all of it is morally wrong, that it's repugnant, but we can at least work to change it. And that's really what we need. A deep change on this issue. So anyways, what I want to move on to is saying, while we need to make sure that we make the infrastructure and actual investments, that we can treat this as a humanitarian issue, not a militaristic issue, because once again, Donald Trump responded to a lot of these issues by allocating military to the US border instead of what we actually need is investments in USCIS processors, in the people who can process people's visas, in the investments in social services so that children are in a safe environment while their family member is located and verified. And again, that this isn't a one-time issue. Every time this happens, folks like to weaponize it and pretend that this is a new emergency. It's not. And we should be doing better by now. And if we actually want to solve this, we will get to the root. We should be addressing the root causes of these issues with our foreign policy, our economic policy, our trade policy, and our climate policy, because this is going to, the volume of these shifts are going to increase as droughts increase, as farmers in other countries are not able to make the living that they're able to make, as rural communities and other communities destabilized by violence. You know, we have decades of interventionist foreign policy that have contributed to this issue. And people don't want to talk about it, but then they want to act like this is brand new every time. So we have a choice to make as a country. If we're actually going to solve this issue holistically, humanely, like our own families did. You know, so many people, I hear the stories where their grandmother or their grandfather came to the United States through Ellis Island when they were 15 years old, fleeing God knows what, horrors. And their parents made a choice that if they had to never see their child again, but they felt like their child would be safer coming here to the United States, that they made that heartbreaking choice. And people tell that story, that Ellis Island story, about their family, about their grandparents, about their great-grandparents, and yet they fail to see themselves in these kids. So we have a lot of work to do on our policy, including addressing the policy that makes these children unaccompanied to begin with, because it's easier to send a child alone in our immigration policy than it is to have a family come together. So there's a lot of work that we have to do. We have a lot of legislative proposals. I'm a prime sponsor of the Roadmap to Freedom Act, where we start outlining some of the legislative solutions to this. But we got to stop using immigrants as a political weapon and start actually caring about the same legacy that they have that ties our history and destiny up with them. So that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that answer. We're going to go to the second question. Alan from Jackson Heights asks, can AOC please address what the Congress, how will Congress address the almost daily crime against Asians in New York City area?
So I want to thank you for that question. As we know, this week we saw one of them, just a horrifying incident in what we witnessed in Midtown Manhattan with one of our Asian elders and neighbors and New Yorkers that was attacked in the street. And not only do you have the primary horror of that aggression, but you have the secondary horror of seeing bystanders not only ignore what happened, but close the door on her. And I just wanted to take a moment to just speak directly to our communities here that have been impacted in our Asian communities in our district, and to know that our community stands with you, that you are safe with us, you are safe, and we are dedicated to your support and your protection and standing up for you. And that includes my office. This is the consequence of this is the consequence of just the rising tide in racism that has gone not only unchecked, but frankly encouraged over the last 4 years. And that doesn't change with an election. We now have this can of worms that has been opened up that we're going to have to take a long time to address. But people don't have time, because the communities that are being targeted right now, whether it was over the last several years, the anti-Semitic attacks that were happening in the city, Islamophobic attacks where people's hijabs were being ripped off on the subway, and now we have this, where our Asian elders and our Asian, brothers and sisters and members of the community are being targeted for attack. So one thing that I think is really important is that I'm asking our community, if possible, please get bystander training. I believe the city offers it, and there are many, many resources in order to get free bystander training, to know what to do and to know what to look for, because there's so much that we can do, but a lot of that work and a lot of what can be offered is repair after the harm is done. And what we want to do is prevent the harm from happening in the first place. And part of preventing that harm from happening in the first place is each and every one of us as a community to sign up for bystander training, so that we know what to look for and we know how to safely intervene and defuse and de-escalate a situation and have a person feel protected. It's on all of us. It's not on our Asian community to protect itself. It's on all of us to protect each other. And so I am saying that part of my work and part of all of our elected officials' work and community is to make sure that those trainings exist and to support that infrastructure. But first and foremost, an actionable thing that each and every one of us can do is take that bystander training so that we can be part of a culture that can defuse and identify and prevent these things before they happen.
Thank you. We have dropped the link to the bystander training in the chat, so please use that as a resource. Our next question comes from Michelle. She's an East Elmhurst constituent. She says, we need gun reform laws passed. We can't rely on executive order or state laws. In my community, we have had more episodes of gun violence, what feels like more, but unsure if that is biased from what is covered on the news recently. Even so, we need to bring both sides together. Gun reform is not a ban on guns. We need to get gun-owning Americans to endorse this and demand change too. What are your ideas?
So this is such an important question, especially in what we saw recently, not just in Atlanta, but now just waves of shootings that we're seeing. It's so important that we actually get the facts on legislation that's been passed. So for example, let's start with HR 8. I am a proud co-sponsor of HR 8, the Background Checks Act of 2021. Very quickly, this bill would expand background checks to be required for all firearm sales. And in doing so, HR 8 will close several gun show and online sales loopholes by making it illegal for anyone who is not a licensed firearm importer, manufacturer, or dealer to trade or sell firearms to another person. This is just one step. Background checks. That's it. That's it. Background checks. That's it. I'm not saying that's it for our entire agenda, but that's the core of HR 8. And the fact that there's this much resistance to just background checks it's just beyond. And so the good news is that because you all have worked so hard to send a Democratic House, to send a Democratic Senate, and to send a Democratic White House, we are pushing very strongly for gun safety laws to be put in place. And it is really important that, this is not about taking firearms away. This is about basic gun safety. Basic gun safety. And at some point, we really got to ask why some people are so opposed to a background check. These are weapons. They're weapons. And there should be laws on the books to ensure that there's safety around responsible gun ownership. And, that's just basics. We're very different and we're a very diverse country. And people want to say, we're turning the entire country into New York City, et cetera. We have very strict gun laws on the books in the city because we're also a very dense urban environment. And when we talk about gun violence, we can't just be talking about mass shootings. We also need to be talking about gun violence in communities like the ones in the city, like 2 years ago when there were shootings in Brownsville, Brooklyn. This is not just about mass shootings. This is about basic gun safety across the board, including background checks. And so HR 8 is an important place to start. And there are many other areas where we can elaborate, but that is the first step. If we can get background checks through, then we can build on that and have further conversations about how we can add and create just a more safe environment.
Thank you for that insightful answer, Congresswoman. Our next question comes from Iris, a Bronx constituent. I would like an update about plan for infrastructure projects and jobs for our community.
Oh, great. So as many of you know, if you haven't been able to catch up on the news, if you've been at work, we have had, or rather the Biden administration unveiled its Build Back Better infrastructure proposal. Now, here are some of my initial thoughts on the proposal. I think that the scope of what the Biden administration has laid out is very encouraging and it's admirable. The vision that they put down, and going so far as to talk about land use, to talk about billions of dollars in rail, in EVs, in making sure that we're putting EV charging stations across the country, to make sure that we are making investments in Amtrak, in public transit, in roads, bridges, care, et cetera, is really important. However, I think the vision is good. I think we can make it broader, but even if you have the vision that the Biden administration has put forward, my concern is that they have allocated $2.25 trillion over about 8 years to act out on this vision. And it's just not enough. If we actually want, in good faith, to make this vision and the commitments that they've put down happen, we need a more robust investment. I have real serious concerns that 2.25 trillion over 8 years is not going to get us there. And for context, because people may say, oh my gosh, that sounds like a big number. You know, what is that? And we see these big numbers thrown around and we don't know, what to toss around. One allocation that we saw was about $40 billion for public housing nationwide, right? That's part of in the plan. For context, NYCHA, the New York City, Housing Authority, already needs about $40 billion just to get up to code and just to get to the point where we're making up for the underinvestment during Republican Congresses and administrations. And so we need a lot more than 40 billion if we're going to go and make these investments across the country. And that's just getting NYCHA up to code. That's not including new build. That's not including actually leapfrogging these buildings and retrofitting them to green standards. That's to make sure that these horrifying things that we see every winter, where our residents in NYCHA don't have hot water, and where you see that their apartments are just not in a humane condition, that's just to get it up to in relatively acceptable zone. And so to talk about the context of what we need, that's why we need so much more. And so I agree. I am encouraged by the vision laid down by the Biden infrastructure plan, but I'm concerned that the numbers that they've allocated won't get us to that vision that they themselves have agreed to. So I'm going to be hard at work, making sure that we get those mechanisms up. And to make sure that we include things like the Green New Deal for public housing, and also making sure that the climate piece of this is also really integral.
Thank you. Our next question is from Leslie, a Bronx constituent. Who pays for these trillions of dollars in stimulus?